I'm going to speak to you about IFPRI's action plan for social protection. We all now know that increases in food prices over the last 24 months is creating rising numbers of poor and hungry people. There is a visible face to the food crisis, the noisy food riots that we see on television and so forth. And this visible face creates some immediate pressure or logic for social protection responses. But to understand the logic and structure of appropriate social protection responses to the rise in food prices, it's important to recognize a growing risk of a quieter but no less momentous crisis whose effects may be felt for decades. Poor people in developing countries spend a large share of their small family budgets on food. In countries such as Ethiopia and Bangladesh, it is not uncommon for 50% or more of the family budget to be spent on staples, cooking oil, sugar, and perhaps a few spices. With diets already so Spartan, the poor cannot afford to be passive when faced with a rise in prices on the order that we have witnessed. They seek out extra income. They are creative with the resources they have. But these can only go so far. Eventually, the poor in both urban and rural areas are forced into what we social scientists so inelegantly call coping strategies. Coping strategies are the hard decisions the poor are forced to make when faced with a shock, such as a dramatic rise in the price of basic staples. Selling off the last of their livestock, withdrawing children from school, mothers searching for additional income, and leaving their infants in the care of another child. We do not have hard numbers on the number of poor people who are currently using these strategies, but we do have anecdotal information that they are being used. These coping strategies can help the poor deal with the current crisis, but they carry long-term costs. In many parts of Africa, households that sell off their oxen significantly impair their ability to grow food, which not only makes them vulnerable to future price shocks, but also makes it hard for them to save enough money to replace those oxen in the future. Once girls are withdrawn from school, the likelihood that they return is low. And we know that, just as improving the nutritional status of infants conveys lifelong benefits in terms of cognition and productivity, we know too that malnutrition carries long-term costs in terms of lost health, schooling, and income generation. In other words, absent effective international and national responses, coping strategies that the poor are forced to adopt carry a high risk of long-term, irreversible consequences. Not only do these strengthen the humanitarian case for action, but they also create an economic rationale for doing so. It is less expensive to prevent such irreversibilities than it is to try and fix them later. To be more blunt, actions to prevent these long-term consequences are far more than handouts. They are integral to sustaining reductions in poverty and hunger for years to come. These ideas, which are well grounded in research undertaken at IFPRI and elsewhere over the last 10 years, provide the foundation for our emphasis on investing in social protection as an important policy action. We see this as having two components. As part of the emergency set of responses, protective actions that mitigate short-term risks, and as part of the resilience package, preventative actions to preclude these longer-term negative consequences. At the core of protective actions is the financing of the international emergency response system, so that globally resources to support existing programs are in place, and that there are sufficient resources available should a major drought or flood occur. It would be a tragedy if, forewarned with the information we all possess, that people starved to death following a natural disaster because governments in better off countries were unwilling to commit resources now. It is equally important to work with national governments in helping them shape, and in some cases financing their immediate responses. It is critically important that these are well designed and implemented. A poor response, such as indiscriminate urban food subsidies, may be difficult to reform or replace. Where food markets are well functioning, where food is available, albeit at a high price, providing the poor with cash transfers can be an excellent way of protecting them against the immediate effects of the crisis. Where food is absent or markets thin, food transfers are appropriate. Preventative actions complement and augment these protective actions. While their shape and function will differ by country circumstance, broadly speaking, these should have three focal points. The first is preserving the productive capital of the poor. For example, an important innovation in the lives of many more poor people, particularly in South Asia, has been the introduction of microfinance institutions, MFIs, who provide finance, working capital, and saving services to the poor. The food crisis may be threatening the substantial progress that these institutions have made in reducing poverty. By undermining the ability of their clients to repay, the crisis may be weakening the ability of these institutions to make loans. So there is a real role for bilateral and multilateral aid agencies to work with these MFIs to see how they and their clients are being affected by this crisis. In some cases, injecting liquidity into these MFIs will give them the flexibility to reschedule debts, just as government intervention in the US housing market is being used to ease the malign effects of the credit crunch here. In other countries, creative support to asset markets, such as those for livestock, can help prevent asset depletion by the poor. The second focal point is that of schooling. Many countries in Latin America, and increasingly countries elsewhere in the developing world, have conditional cash transfer programs, commonly called CCTs, in place. At their heart, these programs offer a social contract between beneficiaries and the state. The state provides financial resources to poor people, and in return, parents promise to send their children to school. These programs are typically well-targeted, and in many parts of Latin America, well-run. They can be used to address the current food crisis, either by scaling up, that is, by taking on additional beneficiaries, or by providing additional transfers to existing beneficiaries hard hit by the crisis. CCTs are less common in Africa, but many African countries have well-run school feeding programs. Work by researchers at IFPRI and elsewhere show that these are effective at keeping children in school while raising test scores. Take-home rations, in particular, can be targeted to households and children in need while preserving and enhancing human capital formation. The final focal point is that of maternal and preschool nutrition. As the recent series of articles in The Lancet has shown, there exists a significant number of interventions that can effectively improve the nutritional status of preschool children. For example, twinning support for complementary feeding with food supplements will reduce the likelihood of stunting and subsequent risk of death amongst children less than 36 months of age. Ensuring adequate intake of micronutrients for children and mothers, particularly iron, zinc, vitamin A, and iodine, is critical. And here, there is scope for linking nutrition interventions with support to agriculture, through, for example, the dissemination of biofortified crop varieties. Social protection should not be the only response to the food crisis, but it is critical if its long-term, irreversible consequences are to be avoided.